once mighty army of Azeroth lay among the blackened and charred remains of Stormwind Keep. Those that escaped fled across the Great Sea, bringing tales of the suffering they had faced at the hands of the Orcish hordes. Eager to engage in battle once again, the Orcs constructed...
Dune 2 started the RTS genre. Command and Conquer defined it. And somewhere there beneath the surface was Warcraft as well. It was received well enough, people liked it, but that wasn't what you would call a trendsetter. It didn't really find the genre, it just sort of meandered around it, hoping that Westwood would put the final touches on what we understood of as an RTS. But since people liked it, Blizzard got to work very quickly on making a sequel. This was the old Blizzard, and I mean the oldest Blizzard. The Blizzard that could work in a very short time frame with a very small crew with a little money to make a game that is the definitive improvement over the previous generation, without reinventing the wheel, without changing everything, honestly without some of what made Blizzard what Blizzard is. Possibly the defining moment that made Blizzard what Blizzard is, or what Blizzard was, is the reception they got from the first showing of StarCraft, when it was just a slight improvement of today's video game, Warcraft 2: Tides of Darkness. This was a more streamlined version of Warcraft. It dispensed with the idea that you needed roads to place buildings, you could just plump them down anywhere. It improved the controllability of units, of buildings. It had vastly superior pathfinding and AI, though the units were still what you would call not really interested in the lives of the people right next to them and would require constant supervision to do pretty much anything. But it was without a doubt an improvement, an extension of it. It added something that not even Command & Conquer actually had: naval combat. Yeah, you had naval units in Command & Conquer, but they were not controllable. Here they were. And you also had flying units. Warcraft 2 is one of the earliest examples of combined armed warfare in a fantasy setting, at least, where you would have even submarines duking it out on the same map with knights and archers, catapults and dragons and other flying things. I'm sure it's not the first RTS to do this. There's probably been one between Command & Conquer and Warcraft 2 in those couple of months, where probably the entire genre sort of exploded and began to flourish at its fullest. But Warcraft 2 was among the most popular ones of the time. And without a doubt, one of the main reasons why it became so beloved was its art style. This was back when Warcraft looked like a beautiful cartoon, and yet it had a bit of darkness to it. All the artwork you would see in the game, in the briefings, in the cinematics, that looked serious. That looked like, oh my god, these things are amazingly drawn by Metzen. And in game, they would be charming, they would be funny. And there's also one thing that sort of stuck with me regarding the visual style, and that is the icon used for the peons, the orc working unit. For many years, I thought it was something other than what I should have thought it was. It wasn't until Warcraft 3 that I realized, oh, I was actually looking at it wrong. And it wasn't until the internet that I realized that I wasn't the only one. Really, this is what I was thinking of when looking at the peons icon. I could not see the actual peon's face until after Warcraft 3. The first mission you play with as the Orcs sort of makes you think about Christmas, because their headquarters is filled with red things and some green stuff. It sort of looks like it's covered in Christmas decorations. It's so jolly, even though you're going all around the map, kicking people in the face, killing them, leaving their corpses to rot under the sun. It's so cute. And this is what really cemented the style of Warcraft. That it's cute. Yeah, it's about a war, but it's so precious. And everything is so comedic in its portrayal. If you click on a unit for long enough, it'll start doing funny things. It'll start saying, "Ooh, stop poking me." Whereas if you click on the various critters around, the seals, the sheep, and sometimes I believe there were boars too, you click on them for about 10 times and they explode. They leave no casualties around them, but it's a very comedic way of approaching the idea of, hey, let's have neutral creeps in this game and that aren't actually dangerous to you at all. They serve no other purpose than to give some life to the environment and explode, because why wouldn't they? That, without a doubt, is one of the best attributes of the game. Because in terms of actual gameplay, compared to what we have now in terms of RTS, it's fine. It won't blow your socks off now, but I did used to love it back then. Making a bunch of units, some footmen, some archers, some grunts, some axe throwers, bunch of ogre magi, and then slamming them one against another until something died. It didn't really factor into my head back then quite a lot that, you know what, apart from some upgrades where one faction gets more range, one gets regeneration, and the fact that the spells are different, and Blood also is kinda good, honestly. They're the same faction, to the point where Nod and GDI from Command & Conquer were better differentiated, even though they were both human factions that relied on mechanized combat and some infantry. Blizzard still had not properly understood the concept of asymmetry in an RTS, though they would prove they had understood it quite well with StarCraft. But this was 3 years before StarCraft. And honestly, I wouldn't say that necessarily makes Warcraft 2 a bad game. It makes it a game that's not as interesting in the long run because both factions are kind of the same. But it makes it very approachable, it makes it very friendly, I would say, to newcomers. Also due to the fact that the first missions, you can pretty much play them without any chance of actually losing. None. You're not meant to lose them. They're not even what you would call a tutorial, they're just kind of lame. Comparing this to some of the later missions, especially the first missions in the expansion where you are expected to die quite often, unless you used your units to the best of their abilities. Though to be fair, there is a bit of a difference between the way that missions were made in the expansion. The campaigns of the original game, the Orc and Human campaign, they were focused mostly on being strategy games. There were some elements that you would have seen in the previous game, where you would go in the previous game to explore some dungeons. You would have some of those more unit-focused and even hero-focused missions, but for the most part they were RTS missions. Whereas in the expansion Beyond the Dark Portal, made by Cyberlord, the studio that made everybody's expansions usually, you mostly had hero-focused missions and not a lot of building in them. They had different styles, but they were both good in their own right. Story-wise, they were both good enough, though I would say that the expansion managed to be a bit more fleshed out. On account of it had a smaller scope with just a bunch of characters, a few of them, not a whole gigantic sprawling war. It was still Blizzard trying to find its footing with telling a story in a game, and they still did it via the method of the stories from both factions automatically conflict with one another and only one of them will be true and you won't find out which one until Warcraft 3, or if you read the novels maybe. It would be another 5 years after the release of Warcraft 2 until Blizzard actually started to pump out dozens of novels, one, maybe even two each year, trying to flesh out the story of their universe. Though if you did want to know more about the story, you could always check the manual. It was still that age when you would have to read the manual to learn more about pretty much everything. Not that I minded, Warcraft 2, Diablo, games made by Blizzard at that time had really good manuals with detailed information and the lovely sketches of Chris Metzen. In terms of actual gameplay, now I said that the game was friendly to newcomers. That's actually wrong. What I should have said is that it is inviting to newcomers. In terms of the way it's played, it is so goddamn micro-intensive that it sort of puts you off after a while, and you just start using cheats because it's easier that way. Not being able to build more than one unit, not being able to select more than 9 units, not being able to... I actually believe that in the first version, the DOS version, you couldn't double-click to select all units of a single type. Thankfully, you could drag and select, and it did have right-click functionality built into it, so it wasn't completely horrible. It was just kind of more geared towards people that love abusing their mouse and have really high APM. And the units did require kind of a lot of micromanagement. They would ignore their friends being murdered right besides them. They would never use abilities on their own, so you had to use them for them. And sometimes they would still kind of get lost on account of every unit was a square. Yeah, I know they didn't look like squares, but they were squares on a 2D plane, so they had to find their pathfinding via the squares. So they could pretty much bottleneck themselves at every opportunity, and you're actually sort of encouraged to find ways to get the enemy to get stuck that way by building towers, or by shaping the woods. Deforestation was the highlight of this game. You could tear down forests to build your fleets of ships and mighty armies, great war machines, or dwarves. They didn't require wood, I don't think so, but you could get them to explode and blow up a bunch of trees. And the forest aspect was actually important factor of the game. It was a natural barrier that you could erode with time, so you would find it quite often on multiplayer maps where you didn't want people to start rushing themselves instantly and, have a bit of a build time, have a bit of a chance to build up their armies so they would be better prepared for combat when the enemy came knocking at the woods. It was a touch that I always adored about this game. It was both a resource and an element of the environment that could actually help you tactically. It was about as close as Warcraft ever got to having something like the spice from Dune 2, or the gems and Tiberium from Command & Conquer Red Alert. A resource that isn't fixed into a single place, a resource that can't be closely guarded. Because it's a forest, it's a big thing. You'll be chopping at one end, someone else chopping at another end. You'll be fighting over it constantly. It's not something you can lock down. And of course, you did have other resources in the game. Gold in the traditional gold mine where people go in and come out. And oil. Yeah, it's a bit of a step up from being pure medieval fantasy. I actually read at one point that the idea for the original Warcraft 2 was to have fighter planes in it and even advanced technology to a more modern point, which kind of explains a lot about World of Warcraft and its motorcycles and other things. But having 3 resources was actually something neat at the time. It wasn't just 1, it wasn't 2, it was 3. You had to be all over the place to get everything you want to do. To be fair, you didn't actually kind of need oil unless you're actually specifically doing ships. And why a sailboat needed oil, I'll never know, but still it needed oil. The later games would reduce the number back to 2. 2 was more manageable, 2 that were usually in the same place and you could mine them with no problem. To the point where you kind of have to wonder, why do we even have them anymore? If the economy is, in StarCraft and in games like it, a finite equation that's already been solved with a fixed number of units you could have mining things effectively at any given moment, why bother with it? Yeah, there's harassment, there's disruption, okay, have there be an automatic process with a hacking and counter-hacking upgrade you could build and spend, because it would be kind of the same thing. To be fair, StarCraft 2 did add a couple of things that are a bit more interesting, like launching a mule at your opponent's resource gathering area to steal their minerals. It was something, so there is that. But I do miss the forests. Something that wasn't just one control point. And that to me will always be one of the highlights of Warcraft 2. You can no longer buy the game. Blizzard is not selling it on its store. It hasn't offered it for free like it did with the Lost Vikings. And there was the question at one time of creating a remake of it, or at least an HD upgrade like what they did with StarCraft. But they sort of got to the point where they realized, well, maybe the game wouldn't be all that great if we did remake it. And yeah, to a certain extent, they are absolutely right. A lot of the charm of Warcraft 2 was in its style and its simplicity of what the genre was back then. Compared to StarCraft, it's not a good game, but it's so charming. And you can't put a price on charm, which is why they should re-release it for free, or at a lower cost than StarCraft 2. You may have noticed a trend with most of the games I've talked about this month being real-time strategy games. That's a trend that's gonna continue next week with something that sort of changes what an RTS is. Anyway, to a point. Also, all the games I've talked about up until now this month were ones I grew up with, whereas the next one I really didn't play that much, though I wish I kinda had. And its sequel is the reason why Tale of Doom, my book, is not called something else. Goodbye.